Thank you so much for being here. This is Mr. Ippolito, and welcome to our Early Republic unit exam study session here on YouTube Live. Thank you so much for joining us, whether you're here live and joining us for the live experience, or you're watching the recording later. Happy you're here. If you are here live, want to share a couple of things with you with regard to the chat because I definitely want to be able to answer your questions. I think the Heart District still has it so that the rule is you cannot chat in a YouTube Live if you are on your Heart District Google account, Heart District YouTube account. So if you would like to participate in the chat in the live stream, go ahead and you just log in with with a personal Google account, and that way I can see you in the chat. If that is not possible to do that, that's okay too, because I'll be checking my email as well to check and see if we have any questions via email. Also helping me out in the chat is my daughter, Libby. So Libby is coming to us from Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. Good evening, Libby. Thanks for helping. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to everybody for joining us. If you want to go ahead and drop your name in the chat, if you are willing to share your name, then I would love to give you a shout out. I definitely see Steve Solomon. So hello, Steve. You are here. I'm not sure who SM Savage GT is, but you're here as well. Logan, it's good to see you. I see you just joining us there in the chat. Hello to you. If you would, like I said, you want to drop your name in the chat, and oh, Carter. Thank you, Carter. All right. I'm going to go ahead. Here's the way that I'd like to do this is I would like to go ahead and take you through the study guide. I'm going to try to make the best use of your time. We'll be here for about an hour and try to make it so that you are ready to go, whether you're in period 2 taking the exam tomorrow, Monday, February 2nd, or you're in my periods 4, 5, or 6 classes taking the exam on Tuesday, February 3rd. We're going to get you ready and rocking and rolling. Okay. Let's go ahead and Libby, I'm just going to have you put in the chat if you can see the screen that I am sharing right now, which I'm hoping that you can. And let me try to do a full screen. Can I do a full screen? No, I can't. All right, close it up. All right. Hey, so this is our study guide. I tried to connect my iPad to screen share and it wouldn't do that. So this is the next best thing. This is my study guide that I annotated using Google Drive. Now, by the way, thank you, Libby, all the way from Salem, Oregon. I appreciate that. Shout out to you, Libby Ippolito. Uh, this study guide, by the way, the original blank study guide, of course, I've already given you, and it's available in digital format on Google Classroom. But this I just dropped this in Google Classroom like 5 minutes ago, this particular link. And so this is, and my daughter Libby is, oh, thank you. Libby, remind me at the end, and I'll share that picture of you because I'm trying to multitask here right now. This annotated study guide. This is with all my notes. Like this weekend, I have been annotating like a fiend. I'm trying to model the type of annotation that you might want to do when you are given a study guide or any materials by me or any other teacher. So hopefully this will help. Basically, there are 5 different parts of our unit, right? There is the peaceful transfer of power. You can see all my notes. There's Thomas Jefferson, ideals and contradictions. There's Native American resistance and Tecumseh. There is the War of 1812. Did I say 5? I think I meant 6. The Star Spangled Banner and American nationalism. And finally, part 7 is Jacksonian democracy, expansion and limits. And then some vocab, and we can talk about the vocab, but hopefully we're going to be going over most of the vocab as we go along. So, like I said, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat or email me. And otherwise, we're just going to go ahead and dive in and get started. I also should tell you at the top, because this is a question that I will probably get throughout the live stream. Mr. Ippolito, how many questions are on the exam? Well, as I included in the study guide, and I can now affirm, there are 25 multiple choice questions. I might decide tomorrow morning to add some more, but as of right now, 25 multiple choice questions of varying length and complexity. And then I currently have 5 short answer questions, don't get too upset about these short answer questions because I'm going to explain them, kind of what to expect. But five short answer questions. One of them, Libby, you might have to remind me at the end. One of them is going to be a little bit more free form. So I want to talk about that, but I want to wait until the end. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into um, our first thing, which is the peaceful transfer of power. We started off right as we came back in January. We started off by kind of reviewing a little bit of seventh grade history. If you remember this chart that we looked at, the cause of death of Roman emperors, where 80% of the death of Roman emperors was a violent death. And then we talk about how here in the United States, we have what's called a peaceful transfer of power, where we go peacefully from one group of Americans in charge of the government, or in this case, in charge of the presidency, to another group of Americans. We go from one political party, our two political parties today, the Democrats and Republicans, and that power passes peacefully from one party to another. But that doesn't automatically happen. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says that, the person who loses, should just sort of peacefully accept it. That is something that intentionally had to happen the very first time that we ever had this kind of contest, which was the election of 1800, right? So it was tense and divisive for a couple of reasons, and I want to show you this right here. First of all, political parties. The Constitution never planned for political parties. And so if you're looking back at the history, like we talked about, George Washington really doesn't want to affiliate with a party, right? George Washington is just a man unto himself, president unto himself, our first president. And then John Adams is his vice president. So passing power from George Washington to John Adams, not a really big deal. But then in the election of 1800, you're going from this Federalist, John Adams, who loses, ends up actually getting third place, right? Because of a weird technicality we're going to talk about in just a moment, a technicality that doesn't even exist anymore. But John Adams is going to come in third. He's the Federalist. Thomas Jefferson is the Democratic Republican who's going to win. But if you recall, there was also an electoral tie. You can see that right there, right? We didn't even plan for a tie, but the Constitution had a solution for that. So let's talk about the tie first. So there's a tie. This is at a time where the winner of the presidential election under the Constitution gets to be president, and then the second place person gets to be the vice president. Well, the Democratic Republican elector who was supposed to not cast his vote for Aaron Burr accidentally did. And so that ended up with Jefferson and Burr being in a tie. It went through several ballots, and then finally, after I think it was the 32nd ballot, and with the influence of, if you remember from the musical in December, Hamilton, with the influence of Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson wins. And so there was division there. There was oh my gosh, is our country going to handle having a tie? Yes, we did. The Constitution had a provision for it. But then we also have these political parties, right? So there was really a lot of bad blood, not so much between Jefferson and Burr. They were from the same political party. So it was a little more dramatized than the musical Hamilton. But where that bad blood in the election of 1800 really existed was between John Adams and the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. And so there comes this question on March 4th, 1801, when John Adams is supposed to leave. This is at a time the White House is finished. John Adams was the first president to live in the White House. And so there is this question of whether or not, like, is John Adams going to leave peacefully? Is he going to pitch a fit? Is he going to try to file a lawsuit? Is he going to try to assassinate Thomas Jefferson? We just don't know what's going to happen. And it turns out he did none of that. John Adams he was upset. He was kind of a little bit of a sore loser, but I would say that John Adams was probably more than anything else just exhausted, wanted to go home to Massachusetts. Did he show up to Thomas Jefferson's inauguration on March 4th, 1801? No. But did he pitch a fit? Did he put up a fight? Did he try to resist in any way? No. So that was the first time that one political party peacefully handed over power to another political party. So this is why I say this becomes the peaceful transfer of power. It becomes a democratic norm in American politics. And then after that, you start to have this tradition, which for the most part stayed. There were four presidents, as we talked about, who decided not to show up for their predecessor or their successor's inauguration. But for the most part in the United States, this is what we do. When you are gracious in defeat, it maintains stability, right? And we even saw that. I'll mention this quickly because you might see this on the exam. Reward to those of you who are watching the live stream. We even saw this in a moment of national tragedy, right? On November 22nd, 1963, when President John F. Kennedy is assassinated. We see just 68 minutes later, we saw that photo. Just 68 minutes later, his widow, Jackie Kennedy, is standing right next to Lyndon Johnson, who was the vice president, got elevated as a result of this assassination, got elevated to the position of president of the United States very quickly. And she is in that photo. She is standing. I'm going to pull up the photo because I think that I'm talking about it, and I just want to make sure that LBJ sworn in. We've looked at this photo before. Libby, I'm going to ask you, as I have asked you previously, can we see this image? Oh, and for some reason, this is a zoomed. All right, we get the idea. Oh, it's very grainy, but hopefully you get the idea. And I think hopefully we can see that. You can see Jackie Kennedy right here. Like her husband's just been murdered 68 minutes before, but she is standing right next to the new president who's being sworn in on Air Force One. And why is she doing this? She's doing this to show that there is a peaceful transfer, even in a time of national tragedy, even when it's in a time where her husband has been murdered, there is this peaceful transfer of power. Okay, and there, thank you. I can now see it. It's on a delay, so I only see it on my little live stream screen a little bit, like 30 seconds after you see it. So Libby, thank you so much. So this is what we do. Moving forward and continuing with that theme of the peaceful transfer of power, Jefferson reinforces this and this is why I want to talk about this, the 1801 inaugural address, right? He says things like, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." It was important to him during this speech to appear very humble. We talked about this in class. Thomas Jefferson appears very humble. He does not want to turn his inauguration into a victory lap. He doesn't want to turn the inauguration into this moment where he gets in the faces of his Federalist opponents and says, "We won and you lost, and now you," like he didn't use this as an opportunity to shove his power or authority or victory in the faces of his opponents. He was a very gracious winner, as many presidents since have been very gracious winners, and wanting to use this speech as an opportunity to unite the country rather than, as opposed to furthering the divide. It was a very nasty campaign. There were a lot of really mean things said in the election of 1800. As there are in most presidential elections that I have witnessed, there have been mean things said from one opponent to the other, about Republicans saying it about Democrats, Democrats saying it about Republicans. But most presidents, not all, but most presidents in their inauguration speeches, when they take over, they take a conciliatory tone. They take this tone of, you know what, let's bring everybody together for the good of the nation. So we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. That was Jefferson's way of saying, let's bring us all together, right? So the election of 1800 and that transition period, that inauguration of 1801, this is the first big stress test of the American democracy. And thankfully, we passed the stress test and we are still around 225 years later. Wait. Yes, 225 years later. I think I got that math right. Okay, speaking it now, let's go ahead and move on. And I don't see any questions in the chat, and I don't see any emailed questions, so I must be doing a great job so far. But let me know. Oh, and I will tell you, for part one, the peaceful transfer of power. Multiple choice. Currently, I always reserve the right to change this. Currently, 3 questions on the multiple choice for this section, and then free response, 1 question on this topic right here. I'm going to give you all the numbers, all the math as it exists now. Of course, always subject to change, but I'm pretty sure this test is locked in and ready to go so that you kind of have an idea of how much you want to study for each section. Okay. Part two, Thomas Jefferson, ideals and contradictions. So let's first talk about this idea of the empire of liberty, right? And what this means. Jefferson had this vision, and it started at the very beginning of our nation, that he was going to create this empire of liberty. And how does he do that? Well, he wants to create this nation of yeoman farmers. I want to give a shout out to ChatGPT, who helped me make this image of a yeoman farmer. I said, give me an image of like a regular, ordinary, everyday farmer, didn't even put shoes on him, in 1801, right? So it's this idea that he wants this nation. He doesn't want Americans to be stuck in factories. He does not want Americans to have to answer to a boss, to have to like clock in and be subject to somebody else. He wants liberty and freedom for all. Now, let me qualify this, for all white Americans, right? And so his vision is that all white families are going to be able to own a farm, have enough wealth to own a small farm, be able to farm their land and have chickens and geese and cows and goats or whatever, so that they can support themselves, sell a little bit on the marketplace and make a little money, and they don't have to. They can be their own boss. They don't have to answer to anybody else. For him, Thomas Jefferson, this is his vision of an empire of liberty. And so, in order to have enough land, or enough farmland, right, for our Americans now and in the future, it was really important to him to make sure that we had land. Now, after the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of 1783, the Treaty of Paris in 1783, we get all of that land. I'm going to scroll down, little cheat here, and just scroll down to this map, which is, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but I do want to show you since I have a map here. Um, if you recall, the treaty said we get all of the land up to this river right here. That's the Mississippi River, right? So originally these were the 13 American colonies just kind of on the coast here. But American colonists really were not allowed by British rule to go beyond these mountains, these Appalachian mountains. And so we get all of this land here up to the Mississippi River. But Jefferson is thinking, you know what? That may not be enough land. And so this is where his values kind of contradict, right? Because on the one hand, before he becomes president, Thomas Jefferson is all about a small and limited national government. The United States government should not have very much power. And so that's his vision. That's what he fights for when he is the Secretary of State, when the country first starts off under George Washington, and then when he's the vice president, gets very frustrated with John Adams and his policies, and he thinks that John Adams and the Federalists are going too far, that the United States government is too powerful. He believes that it should be small and limited. But he also believes that we should be an empire of liberty and we should have lots and lots and lots of land for every American to be a farmer. So this is where those values come into conflict, right? So he becomes president, and in 1803, he has the opportunity to make the Louisiana Purchase. And so this is where we talk about Thomas Jefferson, a man of contradictions, because on the one hand, he's like, okay, government small, government limited. The government, the president can only do specifically what the Constitution says. But on the other hand, he is handed this opportunity by the French to purchase all of the land of the Louisiana Purchase, to double the size of the United States for pennies per acre, right? I think it ends up being like 3 cents per acre. It's the best real estate deal that the United States has ever gotten. And here he can grow his empire of liberty and have more land for more farming, for more American family, more white American families, right? But it doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that he's allowed to do this. And so there's this conflict. He doesn't want the president to have all this power. But on the other hand, if he takes advantage of this opportunity, then he can bring his vision to life. So it's really these two conflicting values. And ultimately, and I think a lot of leaders have to do this when you make tough decisions, right? Whether you're making the decision as a parent or as a school leader or a political leader, whatever, you sometimes like your values come into conflict with each other and you have to decide like which is the more important value. How am I going to reconcile these? And so the way that he reconciled it, we talked about this in class, is he said, well, you know what? It is our treaty power. The president has the power to enter into treaties with other nations. Now, the treaty power was really designed to be like, hey, if somebody goes to war against us, then you're going to help us out. If somebody goes to war against you, we're going to help you out, right? Like treaties or to end a war, that was kind of a treaty. A treaty didn't necessarily mean a real estate deal, but Jefferson, instead of the strict construction, like keeping the power of the presidency and the power of the government in a small little contained box, he's stretching it a little bit, right? He's being a little federalist. He's being a little Hamiltonian and stretching the power of the presidency under the Constitution and using that treaty power because he really, really, really believes in this empire of liberty. So that is how he is going to justify creating greater space for the yeoman farmers of America and approve the Louisiana Purchase. I also want to mention, because this is something that may appear on the exam as well, I'm going to scroll down here as well to kind of finish with the Jefferson talk. Um, I think it's also worth mentioning the embargo of 1807. It was briefly mentioned in the crash course, and I think we may have talked about it briefly in class, but I want to mention it again. And I think the word embargo is a vocab term. So I will mention it briefly here. An embargo is when you decide that you are going to stop trade with another country to usually to kind of teach them a lesson, to send a political message, right? So in 1807, the United States was generally sick of Britain and the way that they were treating us, right? Impressment of sailors. They were they were confiscating goods on the high seas. They were stopping our ships. They were arming the Native American nations in the Ohio River Valley. We were really frustrated with Great Britain. Britain was also still in the Napoleonic Wars, I think. And so we wanted to trade with France, but they were limiting our trade with, anyway, we were mad with Great Britain for several reasons. I'm not sure if the Napoleonic Wars had ended by then or not yet. Uh, that time period's a little fuzzy for my European history. But anyway, the point is this. We were really upset with Britain, and we thought that we would teach them a lesson by issuing the Embargo Act of 1807, which basically says, Britain, we are not trading with you anymore. We are going to stop. Uh, and so part of that was to send a message to Britain, but then we go back to Jefferson's beliefs as well, right? Jefferson's views. And I think in his mind, if we can just kind of live in our American bubble and maybe not deal with he mentioned this in his inaugural address, the exterminating havoc of Europe, right? He talks about how frustrating Europe is and how difficult it is and how like they have been at war with each other for decades, for centuries. And so I think there's part of Jefferson who sees the United States as a way to insulate ourselves from war, as a way to insulate ourselves from the drama of having to deal with the nations of Europe. And that way we can focus on being farmers, a nation of farmers. And so I think that's part of the reason why he felt okay entering into the Embargo Act of 1807 was because he's like, you know what? We should be a nation of farmers. We don't need to trade with other countries. We can just do everything ourselves and we can just kind of remain insular. So I don't think in the long term, I don't think that worked. I mean, it didn't, right? We trade with other countries all the time. We buy and sell with other countries all the time. As we've talked about in class, our biggest trade partner today is China. Back then it was Britain. But I think that was maybe Thomas Jefferson being a little too idealistic there. Some important events. We've already talked about the election of 1800. The 12th Amendment is worth mentioning because this was the fix, right? You remember the whole president and vice president first place in the presidential election gets president, runner-up gets vice president. The 12th Amendment was the way that we fixed this. And I want to stop for a moment and just mention that, one of the beautiful things about our Constitution, there are many, we are not a perfect nation, but one of the lovely things about our Constitution is the ability to have amendments, right? To create amendments. And so the amendment process, I think, is a way for us to it was those founding fathers acknowledging, hey, this document is not going to be perfect, so we're going to leave it to future generations to fix things. One of the problems was this whole president, vice president. We talked about how awkward it would have been in 2016 to have President Donald Trump, Vice President Hillary Clinton after that election. That would not have worked. Or 2020, President Joe Biden, Vice President Donald Trump, or currently President Donald Trump, Vice President Kamala Harris. It's just simply with a two-party system, it simply would not work well to have the person who is next in line to be the president, the vice president, to be like your political enemy or your political rival. It's just not a good fit. So that is why we created the 12th Amendment. So now we have the running mate system, right? Where two people will run together as a pair, as a president and vice president combo, just like in the 2024 election, Donald Trump ran with J.D. Vance. And so they run together. They're both from the same political party. You run as a pair. And so now you can be a little bit friendlier. The president and the vice president have a better relationship. Gabriel's Rebellion and the White Fear of Slave uprisings. I will let you know, those of you who are watching this YouTube live, I will tell you that I am not putting Gabriel's Rebellion on this exam. We will be when we have our larger examination of slavery and slave uprising, the rebellion, the resistance movements of enslaved people. We are going to include Gabriel's Rebellion and that, not putting Gabriel's Rebellion on this exam. Strict versus loose construction, already talked about that, and how Thomas Jefferson going into the presidency was very much a strict constructionist kind of guy, but with the Louisiana Purchase, kind of had to become a little loosey goosey with that. Briefly, I will mention Marbury versus Madison. Because this is the Supreme Court case. We just kind of talked about this briefly, but it's super important. We're going to talk about this power again. It's the power that the Supreme Court has to declare laws and executive actions unconstitutional. But that is not automatic, right? There's nowhere in the Constitution where you find where it explicitly states that the Supreme Court shall have the power to blah, 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 blah. The Supreme Court had to give itself that power, and it does it it has to very specifically give itself that power in the Marbury versus Madison Supreme Court case. That is called the power of judicial review. That is the Supreme Court was much less powerful before the Supreme Court decision in 1803. After this, the Supreme Court, many historians talk about. I need to let's say that this is the beginning of our country, right? We have legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch, right? The legislative branch was up here. The executive was kind of in the middle. Judicial is down here. So legislative, the most powerful when we start off our country. Executive, middle, judicial, like way down here. Uh, Over time, the executive is going to give itself more power, right? The president is going to give himself more power as presidents do things, and they get away with it, right? They're allowed to do it, kind of like we talked about with Andrew Jackson. The executive has raised power. The legislative branch, historians argue that power has kind of fluctuated up and down. But the judicial branch, which was kind of down here at the beginning of our country, goes way up. They are way more relevant and have much more power now that they have the power of judicial review to declare laws and executive actions unconstitutional, basically the final check on the authority of the executive branch and the legislative branch. We talked extensively about the other contradiction of Jefferson believing in liberty while supporting slavery. We've already talked about that extensively in class. And I think we just talked about Louisiana Purchase, and how that challenged his beliefs, right? We already talked about that. So how do Jefferson's words match up with his actions? That's really kind of the big theme of this study of Jefferson right here. How do they match or mismatch? Again, for this section here, four multiple choice questions on Thomas Jefferson, contradictions, Empire of Liberty, all this. He's going to feature in two free response questions, right? Thomas Jefferson. So if you add these all up, 1, 2, 3, 4, like if you add up all these numbers, it's going to equal more than I told you. But don't worry, because sometimes a free response question can cover two different topics at the same time. So Thomas Jefferson, expect this section of Thomas Jefferson, four multiple choice questions, two free response. Libby, how are we doing so far? I don't see any questions in the chat, and so I assume that we're doing good, and so I'm going to keep plugging along unless you tell me otherwise, and I don't see any questions emailed to me. So I think I am now ready, unless Libby tells me otherwise. I am now ready to go into part 3, Native American Resistance and Tecumseh. This is going to be 5 multiple choice questions. There is one free response question specifically dedicated to Native American resistance and Tecumseh. So I just want you to be aware and prepared for that. And hello, Kylo Ren 10. I see you in the chat now. All right. So let's go ahead and Libby is texting me. We're all good. All right, let's keep going. As Americans push west, Native nations face land loss, violence, and broken treaties, and Tecumseh emerges as one of the most important leaders resisting U.S. expansion. I think here's the key theme that I hope that I stressed as we were learning about this. It's really comes down to a question of philosophy about land, because these native nations, they believe, and we saw this in the quote from Tecumseh, right? It was the quote that was in the Ed puzzle. It was the quote that was in the crash course. I don't even think it was in the Tecumseh video, but it was in the crash course and it was in the Ed puzzle, where basically Tecumseh asks, um, "Can can anyone sell the earth?" And now I am completely Tecumseh. Um, And I'm, oh, sell a country. Why not sell the air, the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children? Okay. Thank you, Google, for that. So basically, it's these native nations and these native cultures, their philosophy is, and there's Tecumseh right there, their philosophy is the earth belongs to all of us. Um, so how could you possibly sell it, right? How could the earth be for sale if the Great Spirit made the earth for all of us to live on? And so they don't have the same kind of land ownership idea that the United States had. And of course, the United States property laws, they get their idea of land ownership, property ownership from Europe because that was the cultural that was the cultural heritage that they came from. And from Europe, there's this idea that land is meant to be bought and sold. Real estate is meant to be bought and sold, which was just such a foreign concept to many of these native nations. Why is my land being sold? This is the land that I live on. This is the land that my ancestors have lived on. This is the land where my ancestors, remains are buried. And so, how could I possibly sell this land? Or how could this land be sold without my consent or knowledge? So it was something that was just very confusing and hurtful to these native nations who didn't even believe in the same kinds of land ownership, property ownership concepts. Important people, we've talked extensively about Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader, his brother, Tenskwatawa, the prophet. Remember his little brother. Lalawithika literally means like noisy one. He's that younger brother who's living in the shadow of his older brother. We talked about this is a vocab term worth mentioning, meteoric, right? He had a meteoric career, meaning he burned very brightly during his time. He was very charismatic. People were drawn to him. He assembled a confederation of native nations to try to push back against the incursion of these American settlers, these white American settlers, as they're moving west across the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio River Valley. And he is trying his very best. Let's go back here. He is trying his very best to push against U.S. encroachment, right? So he's trying to, and he knows, he acknowledges that uh, no single nation could survive alone against U.S. encroachment. Encroachment is like that creeping across and invading their lands, their ancestral lands. Um, and so that is why it was so important for him to form this confederation. Another thing I wanted to point out was this idea that was in also in the crash course, that the American Revolution for these Native Americans, these Native nations, was cataclysmic. If you remember that, which I didn't end up putting in the vocab in the 16 vocab terms, but cataclysmic is a great word, right? A cataclysm is a natural disaster, and the American Revolution was disastrous for those native nations, particularly the ones living in the Ohio River Valley. The American Revolution meant independence for the United States, but it meant great vulnerability for native nations. They still enjoyed some protection. Not all of the British troops had left the Ohio River Valley, even though that was technically under United States land ownership at that time. They still populated some forts in the Ohio River Valley. But once the War of 1812 is finished, then all of the British military presence in the Ohio River Valley is gone. And so now those native nations, the Shawnee people and the other nations that they had allied with or had formed the confederation with, they have no support, protection, guns, anything from the British military anymore after that. So um, the other thing that I wanted to mention was the vocab term accommodationist, right? Because again, there were some native nations, some leaders, even within the Shawnee, who were like, you know what, why don't we just work with the white people? Why don't we just work with the government of the United States and maybe we can work out a deal? And so those were the people that really frustrated Tecumseh because he did not want to be accommodationist. He wanted to take a stand. This is the land where he lives, where his family lives, where his ancestors have lived. Why do we need to give this up? This is our land just as much as as it is anybody's. The earth belongs to all of us. Why are they trying to take it away from us? So, so that's everything I think I need to share with you about Native American resistance and Tecumseh. Like I said, 5 multiple choice questions and 1 free response question. Okay. We're now going into the War of 1812, and Libby, we're still doing well, I think. So I'm going to keep moving. War of 1812, sometimes called the Second American Revolution, because it tested whether the United States would truly survive as an independent nation. One thing that stood out to me, and I forget where I heard it, but wars often start because people feel disrespected, not threatened. And I think this is really true of the War of 1812 because for a long time, the United States was not necessarily feeling threatened by Great Britain, but we were definitely feeling disrespected by Great Britain. Why were we feeling disrespected? We were feeling disrespected because they were impressing our sailors, right? They were kidnapping our sailors. Now, there, as you saw in the crash course, I loved the crash course on War of 1812. If you're fuzzy on the War of 1812, just go back and watch the crash course. It's like 13 or 14 minutes, and it has a lot of really good stuff. Why were they upset? Why were they feeling disrespected? It's because the British were kidnapping American sailors. They were interfering with American trade. Um, Thomas Jefferson tried in 1807, 1808 to try to deal with it. Eventually, the British, as we get closer to the year 1812, the British are going to start to get bolder and more hostile and start blockading because we wanted to trade. We want to trade with France. Well, they were at war with France at the time. And so they're like, you know what? We're going to prevent you from trading with France. And so we're going to form this blockade along the Atlantic coast so that you can't trade with France. Um, Another cause of the War of 1812 was the fact that the British military was still supporting the Shawnee and the native nations of the Ohio River Valley. And so we blame Britain for that Indian resistance that exists there in the Ohio River Valley. Um, and so as we get closer and closer to the declaration of war, you now have these war hawks. And this is the time where I want to go down to the map because this is a really good map. We spent time on this map in class, and this specifically deals with the War of 1812, right? This is um, James Madison initially got elected in 1808, right? So James Madison is running for re-election to the presidency in 1812. And this election becomes a referendum on the war, right? Should we be in this war? And you can see that we are starting to become kind of a sectional nation. Our politics are becoming sectional. What I mean by that is this part of the country believes this way, and this part of the country supports this candidate, and then another part of the country believes this way and supports these political candidates. Eventually, that sectionalism is going to become that's going to lead us into the Civil War, right? And so that is you kind of see the rumblings, the startings of sectionalism here. So you can see, and we talked about this in class because we examined the map. States like New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey. These are states that largely benefit from trade. They benefit from having a good relationship with Great Britain because Great Britain at that time is our number one trade partner. So why would they want to be in a war where their business, their livelihood, trade, shipbuilding, making sales for ships, right? Like their livelihood depends on trade with Britain, whether it's buying or selling with Britain, or frankly, trade with any country is ground to a halt because we have something like 12 ships in our Navy and Britain has 1,000. So as long as we're at war with Great Britain, we're not trading with anybody. We're not trading with France or Spain or Portugal or the Netherlands or any of our European trade partners at that time. It is completely shut down. And so federalists who rely on commerce and trade and shipping, they are more likely to vote no on the War of 1812. They are more likely to be opposed to the war. And you can see the states that are more likely to support war and support James Madison and the Democratic Republicans going to war, which is why we had those war hawks are more likely to come from the South and the West, and they are more likely than not to be Democratic Republicans, right? It's those war hawks who are like, did you see what Great Britain just did? I can't believe this. We gotta go to war. Let's go. Right. So they were the ones in Congress who were whipping up this war fever, this fervor to push us into war. It's also the Democratic Republicans who want that land, including we were even thinking we were going to invade Canada and take Canada. That did not end up working out for us, right? Let's go back to the map. Again, it's the Democratic Republicans, that Jeffersonian Empire of Liberty idea that more land is good for the United States. Let's acquire more land, more land, more land, because then that's more farmland to support this idea of this empire of liberty. We did not end up getting Canada. In fact, uh, we did not get anything. No borders changed, no land changed hands. So I want to talk about status quo antebellum. This is another one of those vocab terms, right? Yes, it is a vocab term. Status quo antebellum means everything just goes back to the way it was before the war. So no land changes hands, no borders are changed. And yet things did change significantly, right, for the United States. Because first of all, we proved that democracy allows for disagreement and dissent even in a time of war. The Federalists were painted as unpatriotic and anti-American, but they still were able to dissent. They still had that freedom of speech to be able to dissent and to speak out and push back against the Madison administration as they were at war with Britain. So we still we still allow that to happen. Now, the War of 1812 didn't change borders. I think I heard this in the crash course, but I'm not sure. The War of 1812 didn't change borders, but it changed how Americans saw themselves. We were different after the War of 1812. It gave us this great boost of one of the vocab terms, nationalism. It made us feel this surging sense of national pride. We were so excited to be an American, not necessarily because we won any land, and not we didn't even win the war, but it felt in many ways like we won because, as I mentioned, we talked about this in a couple of my classes. Imagine if, let's talk about our youth football teams here in Santa Clarita. Imagine that Warrior football goes up against the Seattle Seahawks, which is my prediction they're going to win the Super Bowl. So let's say that Santa Clarita Warriors go up against the Seattle Seahawks. And at the end of regulation, let's say that there's no overtime. At the end of regulation, they end in a tie. Well, if a 13 and 14-year-old football team is going up against the professional NFL team and the soon-to-be Super Bowl champs, I might add, and they tie, that's impressive. That's going to feel, for those Warriors, that's going to feel like a win. So imagine the United States. First of all, we won the American Revolution and drove Britain back across the Atlantic Ocean, and we won our independence. But we go up against them again, and Britain is still the most powerful nation on earth. They are the Seattle Seahawks of the world at that time in the early 1800s. And we go up against this nation. And of course, we didn't win this time. We didn't win any territory. We didn't win any concessions from them. But it felt like we won because we tied. And we were going up against a much greater foe, a much stronger, more powerful, more established country. We had barely even been a nation. We had like 10 or 12 ships in our navy. We should not have tied. We should have lost. They should have mopped the floor with us, and yet we tied. And so that's going to feel like a victory. The other thing that made us feel like we were winners was the fact that even after the treaty was signed, the Treaty of Ghent in 1815, news travels slowly back across the Atlantic. Ghent is in what is today the nation of Belgium. News travels very slowly across the thousands of miles of the Atlantic Ocean. And so before we could hear that we had signed the peace treaty and the war was over, Andrew Jackson in January, February of 1815, he wins the Battle of New Orleans. Like, decisively wins the Battle of New Orleans. It was something like, I'm going to get this wrong, but somebody can correct me. It was something like 2,000 British troops killed or captured, and like maybe 12 American troops from Andrew Jackson's army that were killed or captured. It was so lopsided. It was incredibly lopsided. It was a huge victory for Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson becomes a war hero and a national figure as a result of the War of 1812, as a result of the Battle of New Orleans, and he becomes like a super big deal. So if somebody wants to correct me in the chat, you can about what those casualty numbers were. But it was totally lopsided and outrageous. Again, we should have lost the war. We should have lost the Battle of New Orleans. We tied the war. We totally won the Battle of New Orleans. America's feeling really good. The other thing that we got out of it, remind me to go back to the Federalist Party if I forget. The other thing we got out of it was the Star Spangled Banner. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time reviewing the Star Spangled Banner because there are 0 required questions on the free response. Let me just pause for a moment and explain what this means. There's going to be one question I don't want to give too much away, but the final question five of the free response is going to invite you to share kind of your choice of what you'd like to share. I don't want to give too much away. One of the things that you could discuss if you loved the Star Spangled Banner and you loved that lesson and you enjoyed learning about that, you could share about the Star Spangled Banner, but you could share about other things as well. That's going to be question number 30 on the exam. That's a little bit more. So when I say free response, zero required questions, but you could on that one where it gives you the opportunity to share what you've learned. If you want to choose the Star Spangled Banner and American nationalism, you can. Multiple choice, two very loosely based questions. And I say loosely based questions because it really connects back to American nationalism in the War of 1812. We felt really good about ourselves. We felt like winners. It made it like it inspired this sense of this increased sense of American nationalism. Last thing I want to say about the War of 1812 was the decline of the Federalist Party. So in 1814, the Federalists get together. Let's go back to the map because this, I think, will help us. The Federalists get together in Hartford, Connecticut. You can see that Connecticut voted Federalist. They voted for DeWitt Clinton in the election of 1812. So the Federalists get together in Hartford, Connecticut to be like, what are we going to do? How can we move on as a party? How can we like stand for something? Because we can't just be the anti-war party. But of course, they ended up kind of painting themselves as anti-war because that's what a lot of the Hartford Convention was complaining about the war. So they actually had some pretty reasonable ideas. I think they come up with the idea for a line item veto, which you'll learn about in government class. That's reasonable. That makes sense to give the president that power. They come up with some other like reasonable ideas for our country, but they mostly just come off as complainers and whiners because they are not the party in power at that time. And so really what's going to happen as a result of the Hartford Convention, that's going to be the decline of the Federalist Party. Never again is a Federalist going to win a presidential election, and pretty much the Federalist Party is going to be in decline after that. They only the party that will kind of fill in that gap to be the opposition party to the Democratic Republicans. That's going to morph into the National Republicans. That's eventually going to morph into the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson. So the first time that the Democrats are going to have a true opposition party is going to be the Whig Party, W-H-I-G, Whig Party, and they are not going to win a presidential election until 1840. So the Democratic Republicans, National Republicans, Democrats, that same group, the Jeffersonians, the Jacksons and the Jeffersonians are kind of holding power for like the first 40 years, pretty much, of the 1800s. Okay, I think that is it on. That's it for War of 1812. Again, 6 multiple choice questions on the War of 1812. If you're feeling fuzzy, watch Crash Course again. 1 free response question. It's 1 solid free response question for the War of 1812. So I would take that seriously. Star Spangled Banner, again, kind of rolled into the War of 1812 stuff. So I don't think you need to spend a ton of time reviewing unless you would like to discuss what you know about the Star Spangled Banner for that free response question. That's going to be kind of a choose your own adventure kind of question, question 30. Okay. Last thing, and it's good because we have 13 minutes left in our review. Jacksonian democracy, expansion and limits. This is the thing that we talked about most recently. We've learned about most recently. 5 multiple choice questions, 1 free response question. We've already talked so much, so I don't feel like I need to talk about it again, but I'll just briefly mention it. Jacksonian democracy is considered a win for some, not for others. We talked about some of the ways that Jackson concentrated power, right? Like increased the power of the presidency. One of those ways was the veto. We talked in class just recently about how the veto before President Andrew Jackson, the veto was just really kind of considered a method of last resort, right? Like a president should only use this in extreme emergencies if Congress has gone off the rails. Well, Andrew Jackson used it as like, hey, if I don't like this personally, I don't like it, I'm going to veto it. I'm going to say no to it. And so Andrew Jackson uses the veto so much more than his predecessors. And so he's going to be the first president to use the veto as a political weapon. Almost every president since then will use the veto as a political weapon. Spoil system, same thing. It's this idea that rather than qualified individuals taking government positions, people who have experience, people who have knowledge, people who are experts in these fields, you know what? I'm going to appoint my friends. My friends, my supporters, the people that I like, they are going to get those political jobs. And that is called the spoils system. Andrew Jackson starts it, and then it never goes away. Today in modern politics, Democratic presidents use it, Republican presidents use it. Some presidents will use the spoils system more than others. There are some presidents who are criticized more than others of having kind of like unqualified and incompetent people in positions of power, in positions of like life or death positions. For example, one of the things that I talked about in a couple of my classes, I'll give you this example so that everyone can have access to the same knowledge. During Hurricane Katrina 2005, again, talked about this with a couple classes already. There was a man named Michael Brown. He was the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. He was appointed by President George W. Bush. Um, he was criticized, and the spoils system was criticized, and President George W. Bush was criticized because the only experience, this guy, Michael Brown, did not have any experience in law enforcement. He didn't have experience in emergency management or as a firefighter or first responder, did not have any kind of experience that might be helpful as the director of FEMA. Instead, his most recent experience was like as the head of the Arabian Horse Show Association. Like he did horse shows. I think I may have accidentally said dog shows in one of my classes, but he was in charge of horse shows. Now, why is this guy who's in charge of horse shows 1 minute in charge of the Federal Emergency Management Response the next? That was the criticism that George W. Bush's critics were, they were critical of President Bush because they picked a guy who in this time of critical need, in this time of national emergency, Hurricane Katrina, where thousands of Americans are displaced from their homes. They don't have power. They don't have running water. They don't have access to clean water. And so that was a criticism of the spoil system. And again, presidents, Republican and Democrat, get criticized for picking their friends rather than necessarily people who are qualified for the job. So that's the spoil system. Starts with President Andrew Jackson. India removal, we've already talked about how like Andrew Jackson was definitely harmful to Native Americans. We learned about that when we were watching the video on Andrew Jackson Jackson's presidency. The veto power we've already talked about. King Andrew the First political cartoon. That I'm going to scroll down and I'll just show you really quickly. And then Alexis de Tocqueville's observations. I really want to put that on the test. I really want to talk about it more. We didn't. Alexis de Tocqueville, I don't think is on the test. I'm going to double check for you though, because I want to make sure I'm not lying to you and lulling you into a false sense of security here. All right, loading that up over my other screen. We talked in class very recently about who benefited from access to voting, right? It was the common white man, right? Because they were the ones who they did not have political power. Wealthy landowning white males already had access to the vote. It was the poor and middle class white males who did not own property who gained that access. They were the biggest winners of Jacksonian democracy during that time. I'm going to show you another thing in just a moment related to that, but I'm trying to multitask here and look for de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville does not appear at all on the exam. So there we go. I think we've talked about all of this vocab. Let me know. Yeah, I feel like we've talked about all of it. The one word we did not mention was mandate. And a mandate is when a president feels like, you know what? Uh, the people have selected me, and because they've selected me, I must now have a mandate to do my things and enact my policies because they chose me. So if they chose me, then they chose all the things that I represent and all the things that I stand for. That's a mandate. I think we've talked about all these other terms already. So I think we're good to go on the vocab. I do want to, because we're 7 minutes away, I want to show you a couple of images that I think are very likely going to appear on the exam. Very, very likely. This image will appear on the exam because I see it over here on the screen right now. What else is going to appear? This map is going to appear. So I want to make sure that you understand, like, this is the beginning of sectionalism. This is the group that supports the war, right? The War of 1812. The Green, the Federalists are the ones who are opposing the war. This is the King Andrew the First right there. So you can see, we'll zoom in on King Andrew the First. You can see the veto in his left hand there. You can also see that he's trampling on some things. Whenever you see a political cartoon, if it's on the ground, generally, especially if it's underfoot, it generally means that that person is disrespecting those things. So according to this political cartoon, Andrew Jackson is disrespecting the Constitution of the United States. He is also disrespecting, these are some of the Federalist priorities, internal improvements, right? Building roads and bridges and canals and things we're going to talk about 2 units from now. Internal improvements. Those are like trying to trying to build infrastructure that makes it easier to travel in the United States. The United States Bank, obviously, he was very distrusting of the Bank of the United States and wanted to kill that. This says virtue, liberty, and independence, which, if you're an opponent of Jackson, you think that he does not value. And then over here, I think this says judiciary of the United States, because Andrew Jackson, on a couple of occasions, the Supreme Court said, Mr. President, you cannot do that. And Andrew Jackson basically said, well, make me. And so this, if this happened in a modern presidency, if the Supreme Court says, you cannot do this, and if the president says, yes, I can, and then just defies the will of the Supreme Court, then you have a pretty serious constitutional crisis. I'll give one really quick example. In 1974, we talked about Richard Nixon in class before, President Richard Nixon, 1974. The Congress, the House Judiciary Committee, when they're investigating the Watergate scandal, says to President Richard Nixon, hey, you got to hand over those tapes. We hear you have recordings of your conversations in the White House in the Oval Office. Hand over the tapes. And President Richard Nixon says, I'm not going to. And they say, no, 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 hand over the tapes. And he's like, I'm not going to. And so finally they go back and forth, back and forth. They have to sue President Richard Nixon in the Supreme Court. That Supreme Court case is called United States versus Nixon. And the Supreme Court says, you have to hand over the tapes, Mr. President. You must. Your constitutional duty requires, otherwise you're committing obstruction of justice. And so he's like, oh, fine. And so he hands over the tapes, and they're listening and they're listening. Congress is listening, and they're like, oh, this is where it's going to get really good. And all of a sudden, the tape goes silent. And so right at the part where he's about to probably admit his guilt, admit his responsibility, admit his role in the Watergate cover-up, the tape goes blank. Well, that right there, that is obstruction of justice. And so he is most assuredly going to get impeached by the House of Representatives, and most assuredly would get convicted. He would have been our first president ever to be impeached and convicted, kicked out of office, but that didn't end up happening. Libby is texting me. Oh yeah, I will make sure to show the photo. Thank you, Libby. We're almost out of time. A couple more things I want to show first. First of all, it's this right here. It's this graph. Sorry, I'm multitasking again. This graph right here, where it is the U.S. presidential election participation as a percentage of the total population, and there are a few points, right? This is the first point that I want you to see. This goes back to that idea of Jacksonian democracy, which, again, just to be very clear, Andrew Jackson did not give all those non-land owning whites the right to vote, right? Like he was not responsible for that. Oh, my computer's kind of going crazy here. He was not responsible for that. However, he was, it was the spirit of Andrew Jackson, right? It was everything that he represented. It was just that time of wanting to give white males a greater role and greater political power. And so he wasn't responsible. He didn't wave his magic presidential wand. He wasn't even president yet. He was elected in 1828. So he was not the cause of this, but he was the beneficiary of it, right? He was the one who he felt like he represented the common man, even though he was a wealthy landowner himself. He laid claim to that title of I am the president of the common man. And so he is going to win. He's going to be one of the winners of this era of Jacksonian democracy because voter participation increases so significantly, like over triples the amount of participation that we had previously in elections. This, again, just a little bonus content. since you are kind enough to be watching and learning from this YouTube live, this is going to be on, whoops. This is, uh, okay, let's go back. Sorry about this. I am, where are we? Screen sharing is paused. How can I get back here? What, what is even going on? Thanks for your patience. There we go. Okay. Um, this chart, this graph is going to be on the exam. You're going to have to do something with this, right? And something that we talked about in class. So I'm kind of giving you the heads up now that you will want to do something like you're going to want to know this. It's the blue half sheet, right? But it's also here. This is right here digitally as well. So you can see it. Okay. Um, what else do I want to show you? Ah, this is the last thing. It's 8 o'clock. And then the last thing I'm going to share with you, first of all, there's my daughter, Libby. I want to give you the shout out. Libby, thank you so much for monitoring the chat. The chat was I think we were just doing a really good job of sharing information. So there's my daughter, Libby. So shout out to Libby. Thank you. And then the final thing, here we go. Last thing I want to share with you is this map right here. We talked about American politics becoming increasingly sectional. We've talked about this, right? This is the election of 1828. And so this is what I will end on. This is how the vote went down during that period of time. The gold is John Quincy Adams. He is a national Republican. That's the name of the kind of the political party morphing that's happening, right? And so he wins New England because he's from New England. He's from Massachusetts. He wins New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. He wins half of New York. At this time is splitting their electoral votes. He wins half of New York. But then look at this is now the new Jacksonian. This is going to become the Democratic Party. Look at everything that Jackson wins. It is a decisive victory, and it's very much a sectional victory because he wins the South and the West. Andrew Jackson represents the new America. Andrew Jackson represents like these all that look, all these new states here, Vermont and Maine, they're part of New England. So of course they're going to vote for John Quincy Adams. But all the rest of the new states that were added since the original 13 colonies, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, they all vote for Andrew Jackson, right? Because they believe that he represents them. He represents their interests. He represents the common man. And so this is what gives him such a decisive victory. He's also a Southerner. He's also a slave owner. And so he's going to win these southernmost slave owning states as well as, I mean, you look at like all the states that Andrew Jackson wins, and they're either frontier states, right? Like the Ohio River Valley states right here, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and he does win Pennsylvania and New York as well. There's a large rural population, a large like common man population in New York and Pennsylvania, but all the rest of the states that he wins are slave states: Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, North Carolina, like all of these states right here. So American politics are becoming increasingly sectional. He is the first president. This is another part of Jacksonian democracy. He is the first president ever that was from west of the Appalachian Mountains. This is my drawing of the Appalachian Mountains. And so that's the final thing that I'll leave you with. Okay, it is 8:02. Hello. Uh, Libby, I'm assuming because I don't think I ever got any email questions, and I don't think I ever got any questions in the chat. So I'm gonna check. Oh, I'm checking the chat one more time. If he says he's a common man, even though he was a wealthy man, doesn't that make him another man of contradictions? Um, I'm gonna say no. I'm glad you mentioned that, Steve. I'm gonna say no, and here's why. And Logan, while I see you, Logan, and you say, can we get a very brief summary, please? Can you just explain what kind of summary you want? Because I'm not sure, because I'm just catching up on the chat right now, because I wasn't I wasn't looking at the chat for a while. Um, but I'll talk about this. Is Andrew Jackson a man of contradictions in the way that Thomas Jefferson is? And again, this is subject to interpretation, right? As a historian, I would refer to Thomas Jefferson as a man of contradictions because he had like these two competing values. He wants, on the one hand, for government to be small, United States government, big, he wants the national government, the federal government to be small and limited. But then he becomes president. He's like, oh, look at all of the good that I could do if I had this power, right? If I was able to acquire this power, look at all the good that I could do. Um, and so Jefferson's he has these two values, wanting to create this empire of liberty, wanting to keep government small and limited, but then um, there's that conflict of his values. Andrew Jackson, I don't think he ever, I don't think it's I mean, yes, it's a contradiction, but I don't think Andrew Jackson is like, oh, I know that I'm wealthy, but I really want to represent the little guy. I think for him, I think it was a political maneuver. I think a lot of times politicians, and it's again, people from both parties, Democrats and Republicans, who I think will say one thing when the opposite is true. I think they will say one thing to get votes. I think they will say one thing so that they can influence people. I'll give you an example. Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, right? He was the president during the Great Depression and World War II. He was really good. I had this professor in college who said he was like a chameleon on plaid. In other words, he could go to a steel mill, and the steel workers at that steel mill would think this man is the champion of the steel worker, right? But then he could go to a group of bankers who are very different than steel workers, and he gives a speech to the bankers, and then those bankers are like, oh, his number one priority is protecting bankers. And so he could in different settings, he could sort of tailor his speech and his language to get the result that he wanted, which was he wants these people to vote for him, but he wants these people to vote for him. I think that's what a lot of politicians do. And I think that's what Andrew Jackson did. Andrew Jackson wanted to appeal, wanted to come off as the common man, the everyday common man. So I don't think that's a contradiction so much as it's just a political maneuver, right? You say something even though that may not be true. He was not a common, he was a very uncommon man. He was a general. He was a war hero. He was a wealthy landowner. But maybe part of being the common man for him was he had very humble upbringings, right? He grew up with in a very poor family. Dad was out of the picture. Mom died when he was 14 years old during the American Revolution. Like he had a rough upbringing. He had a rough life, grew up in the Waxhaw region in between North and South Carolina. And so even though by the time he was running for president, he was wealthy and, had a lot of land um, but he had very humble beginnings. So I guess in that regard, he could be considered a common man. Okay, I'm looking back at the chat. A summary of the whole thing, like a sentence for each topic. Oh my goodness, Logan. I don't have time for that. It's 8:07. But what you can do, Logan, I will tell you this. I'm not going to go ahead and summarize everything all over again. But I will do this for you, Logan, and for everybody else who is watching. This is what I can do. And this will be the last thing that I do unless my daughter says that there's something else that I need to do. And that is, yes, participants can now. Okay, so here is Google Classroom. And this is the Google Classroom stream. And so you can see, here's what I dropped in the stream. Obviously, this here is now going to become the link to watch this video. If you want to go back and watch the recording, this link right here is the link to all those notes that I just shared with you, right? So the study guide that I annotated, that I spent like 2.5, 3 hours today annotating all of the stuff that I added, it's all right here. So Logan, if that is some consolation to you, that is my gift to you, so you can go and review that. Okay, Libby, unless there's anything else, I think I do see we have an Andrew Jackson fan in in the chat. Okay, well, I think that is it. And is Andrew Jackson related to Michael Jackson? They're both historical figures. You know what? That is an excellent question, and they do share a last name. Are they related? I don't think so. That could be a good, maybe a Google question. But Jackson is also a very common last name in the United States, so I'm guessing no. But you can Google it and find out because I don't know the answer to that. All right, folks, thanks so much. The time is now 8:08. Thank you for sticking around, and good luck on your early Republic unit exam. Period 2 on Monday and periods 4, 5, and 6 on Tuesday. Thanks so much. Have a good evening. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.